Thank you for joining under these complicated conditions, which we don't know what's happening from day to day, but we will keep you informed as soon as we know new things. For now, we are on Zoom probably for 2 weeks, this week and next week. That's the best we know now, and I'm sending out more specific information as we obtain it. A couple of you are still registering, but I see that Grace Kim is here, so Charlotte Stender, so they're new. The canvas includes the basics. Some of the weeks are a little bit different because this year and last year were a little off, and so we're announcing in an email what's happening week by week. Any questions about any logistics like this at the beginning, although we'll have office hours at the end for more detail if you like. Anything quick or things that apply to everybody more generally? I hear a noise. Is someone on mute or no? Okay. All right, let me push ahead. What I did last time, in part because we had an abbreviated work as it's Martin Luther King Day, was to celebrate Martin Luther King's version of how to transform what we can more generally talk of as the American joining together of religion with politics. And then what has happened after Martin Luther King is this is not just the New England version, which Elazar talked about. This has become American with Martin Luther King, but more important, it has become global in the last decades after Martin Luther King. So if you're now talking about China, you're talking about Tibet, you're talking about Indian affirmative action. These ideas are important most everywhere, even if you are, as in Ukraine, fighting against them in some respects. That is, within the Ukraine, within those other East European countries now, within France, you have analogous battles going on or discussions going on within one head. You know, what do I support of my family obligations? What is family duty? What is irresponsible? What is transgression? What is immorality? Immoral is a strong term, but it can be broadly applied to someone who thinks differently. Now, whether you then add to that, they're immoral or they're bad and I'm good, is what we get more of more explicitly in, let's say, courses in sociology and anthropology, where you have the concept of cultural relativism, which basically says, think about what your own background and values may be, and try to listen and look for where and how other people differ. So when I said last time, I feel culture shock when I go to Asia in ways that I don't when I go to Europe, someone said, what are some examples? And so I talked about the taxi drivers cleaning off their taxis, where you have all kinds of things where there's not a conflict, which is a residue of Marx. Marx led in part in the European version or in the American version unions to an alienation of many manual laborers from their own work, cleaning a taxi. Or if they own it or don't own it, that may transform how this works. But in Japan, you can have hierarchy and egalitarianism in ways that need not be in conflict. Okay, so we'll have more examples as we proceed, but that's sort of a broad way of beginning to connect these broader concepts. So put differently, I'd suggest as well another outrageous statement. Capitalism and communism are out of date. We have mixtures in the whole world today. Not to the same degree. We have combinations of more of this and less of that. But in some ways, we need also those as well as some more general concepts, which can then say where and how might this differ And what are those more general concepts like hierarchy? And I'm suggesting here for simple purposes, hierarchy versus egalitarianism. Hierarchy versus egalitarianism, and that's what we got with Genghis Khan. And so if we then try to say, how do these get translated, adapted, becomes more precise, you have to go down in historical time periods and down in geographic units to a neighborhood. So I'm in Bronzeville. I see what different neighbors say. And the biggest thing I've learned in decades here is huge differences. There is no Bronzeville single consensus. Even if the majority support Black power and they're against a stronger version of racial egalitarianism, how you define Black power and integration still is highly contingent on this context and the individual. Okay, so let me thus proceed first with what Genghis Khan in the background of hierarchy. Genghis Khan, just to remind you, was the biggest, most explicit hierarchical builder of an empire in the whole history of the world. I mean, nobody else ever joined China and Russia. And then in turn, let me update you. The second map of empires in the world showed that the British were the largest, if you include across the oceans. Number two was, in that chart of 1890 or so, was Russia. Now, Russia, in that sense, included aspects of Mongolia and more. But why? What's the linkage between Genghis Khan and Russia? Why did Genghis Khan succeed so easily in conquering Russia and, let's say, the whole Soviet era, to use the era? And I'm talking just a few more sentences on this today because this is so central in the news over the Ukraine. And earlier, a couple of months ago, Belarus. The capital of Belarus, and then was Kiev, now the capital of Ukraine, and it was captured and totally burned, and practically all the residents were killed except for a handful that became workers in the armies to help the armies of Genghis Khan. And I read from the Russian culture background how you have pockets of hierarchy and Mongol influence and Genghis Khan more specifically in different cities. All right, so I'll just in a sentence say, how do we link, why did the Russians collapse so easily? Quick answer, because they only really burned one major city totally, the capital, Kiev at the time. There was no Moscow and there was no St. Petersburg. But the main answer is the dukes, the princes, the different heads of regions, the aristocrats and the like across Russia gave in. They didn't fight. They didn't try to fight with those Genghis Khanian horsemen who were so visibly powerful. But most of all, the Russians were divided. And so that's why this is so important in Russian history and why Putin is talking about this so much now, that Belarus and the Ukraine were seen as for the Russians as a central part of the heart of this whole era. But to link the institution, and I mentioned Putin, how did this spirit continue in ways that affect the whole world today? Their quick answer was there was no czar when Genghis Khan invaded. There were only these lower level, more regional leaders. And so the czar and the czardom was only created after 250 years of domination, not heavy-handed, that it was that the Russian princes and others were given a fair amount of cultural autonomy to continue Orthodox religion, all kinds of things. But the point was, after 250 years, the Russians said, hey, we need more control somehow. And so they invented, so one of them became the Tsar. And so Stalin, as World War II was approaching, and they were confronted with a potential invasion from the Japanese and the Germans on both sides, they made Stalin commissioned two films. One in 1937, which was for the invasion from the West, from the Nazis, and the other one was in 1943, 44, the middle of the war. Imagine, you're building guns. You have to have tanks. You need to have, you need food to feed your troops. They commissioned two films to feature this aspect of how Russia must defend itself in ways that worked with huge success and created this massive empire that Putin is so concerned about now. All right, so the first was on the, well, I won't go into the details. I'll try to talk about them a little bit later, but you can look this stuff up. If you look up Eisenstein and Prokofiev, the most brilliant Russian film director and the most brilliant musical composer in the 1930s, joined together with Stalin, and they made these first from the West. And from the East, it was on the rise of the Tsar in the city of Kazakhstan, the third city in Russia, which was the headquarters built by they were then called the Tatars. And they still are a large proportion of the population in Russia today, in that city. They have a theater, they have active culture and so forth going on relatively peacefully. And the Tsar then attacked and militarily defeated the Tatars in this headquarters city of which they had built within Russia. And so that marked, in a sense, the symbolic victory of the Tsars over the children and the grandchildren and nephews and nieces of Genghis Khan. But the Tsar did so by becoming more, I shouldn't say too much so. I mean, it depends on how you want to measure terror or violence or whatever. He did not go to Mongolia, but the Tsar basically, and Tsardom, if you talk to people in Poland, in Hungary, in Yugoslavia, in the Austro-Hungarian Empire or Germany, Tsardom means hierarchy and violence and control and driving out the Jews, etc. Not always. I mean, some Tsars were very pro-Jewish, others were anti-Semitic. But the variations in this and beyond Russia, so I'm giving you the Russian, just a bit of specific detail to say that the social media we have today covering the Ukraine, covering how does this relate to the Olympics in China. And some have even said that the Chinese have asked, can we have 7 days of no destruction before and 7 days after the Olympics? We'll see what happens in the Ukraine 7 days after the Olympics. Okay, but these kinds of issues are with us. Okay, given that background on how and why hierarchy and egalitarianism are so powerful today, I talked mostly, or we saw mostly with the Genghis Khan, the hierarchy part. The quick answer then is, what is egalitarianism? Is first of all what I read you from, talked about ancient Judaism of Max Weber. So the ancient Jews and the ancient Greeks really were the foundations of Western civilization. And they also generated monotheism, which is what I'm giving you now is a quick overview of the readings we didn't talk about for time reasons last time. And I'm just doing this to feed into where we are now. The Greeks and Israelites really, or the Jews created monotheism, which permits linkage to progress in a way that you cannot do if you have, as in most religions and most traditional histories of the world, a view of polytheistic civilizations and many gods. If you have a god of harvest, a god of good weather, a god of maternity, and so forth, you can worship. And so, as there are examples, Banfield discusses, or so I should cite, he's cited within Putnam's book, which we're getting to today, of Southern Italians would go into a church and have their candles and say, I'm not going to burn you, God of harvest. We're not going to burn a candle for you yet. I'm going to wait until you give me a good harvest. That's how trust works in Southern Italy. Whereas in Northern Italy, with the expansion of trade and the spread of egalitarianism of a certain sort, in the cities, the port cities, like Venice, Venice and Genoa, and the trading cities like Florence, they had massive they had city states that were much more moving in an egalitarian direction. Okay, so but one related point to monotheism is that you can measure them, that at least the language, the rhetoric in terms of the rise of, quote, civilization was progress. And you can say that a person is moral, that is good for all of the gods he might worship, instead of saying he's just going to worship the god of harvest because he didn't care about the family or about something else. But if you have one God and who also knows everything about you, as is the Protestant conception, you can't hide anything. And therefore you are judged as a whole person, including your politics and your private life. Whereas in many religions and many families today, people will say, oh, no, separate politics. Or when Richie Daley, or Mayor Daley too, gave a speech here on his father at the USC, the first question he said almost nothing about politics. He talked about the family, what they ate, this and that. And the first question was, didn't you learn politics from your father? What was his answer? No, politics is dirty. We wouldn't talk about politics in the home. The Daley family. Okay. Whereas in New England, the opposite is true. Politics and everything should be morally done and judged by moralistic criteria, which apply to the family as well as to politics. Right? That's the striking difference between the individualism of the Middle Atlantic and spreading then to Chicago with the Irish versus the New England moralism, which you have in Hyde Park and New England and some of the northern suburbs. Okay, so what I'm doing with these contemporary examples of Hyde Park is to make the point that, well, I'll join with history very briefly here. I'm just covering, a long history with a few examples, but I'm illustrating the degree to which, where and how did egalitarianism get from the ancient Jews to us today in Hyde Park and elsewhere in the entire world. The Greeks and Jews codified their philosophy in the Bible. Philo, a Jew from the Hellenic city of Alexandria, codified them both into a single system and which was adapted by Christianity until about 1600. The next phase was Martin Luther, who compromised with the political leaders, especially in Germany. So Luther said to the dukes and the others in Bavaria, or say not so much Bavaria, bad example, northern Germany, central and northern Germany, he said, let me build my Lutheran churches and you embrace Lutheranism as your official religion here in the in your province, and you can choose or you can veto who the ministers will be. Okay, a few years later, Calvin, who was a French Catholic theological student in Paris, said, Lutheranism sold out to the hierarchy. We want true egalitarianism. We want to let the people choose their own religious leaders. And as soon as he began to think that way, he thought, I'm going to get in trouble if I say this very loud. So pretty quickly, he went to Switzerland. and the Swiss then embraced Calvinism. And it joined with Rousseau. So Rousseau in these little towns, these little federations, Switzerland is not a nation. It's a federation of towns, of communes, communities. They don't have strong foreign policy. They've got little individual, and it's highly, the egalitarianism is where the California referenda came from. Switzerland is governed by referenda if it's needed, but they have a strong egalitarian sense, anti-strong leaders, anti the czar. So if we then get to Calvinism, it then goes through multiple changes. I won't go through these except to say that that the most visible global message was, if you will, through Gandhi, and then I shouldn't say Gandhi. Let me say the combination that Martin Luther King joined with Gandhi of the nonviolent Gandhi message with the egalitarianism of Christianity, combined with the moralism of both Gandhi and Calvin, applying egalitarianism not just to the family, but also to politics and to everyone, everywhere in life. And some people have then talked about the US and how is the US different from Europe? And I've sometimes said the US has done almost nothing original. It's all European immigration stuff, more recently non-European. But the most visible thing, which is distinct, which originated, of course, with Calvin, but which makes American politics and political and social life and families different, is the extent to which moralism is joined with politics through egalitarianism. And that you have in ways that Jimmy Carter, as president, started talking about human rights when he was president. The Europeans, the Germans, the French, the Italians said, what kind of country bumpkin is this? You're talking about peasants having rights? You're talking about women having rights like everybody else? How can they say out? And so they talked about, he's some kind of country guy from the US. He doesn't understand real politics. Kissinger's our man. He knows what real politics is. Nixon and Kissinger. Yes, Europeans understood that. Okay, you try to say that today. Look at television when they had the coverage of all kinds of deep political issues dividing, for instance, Italy. You can have a 1 to 2 hour discussion where you have a simultaneous classroom of 15-year-old Italian kids. Then they also had, I saw this in Italy, at the time of the bombings that were going on in former Yugoslavia, the Bosnian bombings by NATO and the Americans. They had a classroom of kids in Bosnia talking with the prime minister of Italy and the president of the European Union, who was an Italian and former prime minister. And so a kid and a teacher, 15 years old, would ask a question of the prime minister, and this is carried for 2 hours, not a snapshot as you get on NBC or CBS or whatever. 2-hour detailed conversation, strictly implementing egalitarianism far more than Jimmy Carter ever would have imagined. So the Italians are considered, I choose deliberately, the most Machiavellian of the Europeans. Look at how their rhetoric and their their implementation in this media event marks a deep transformation in the direction of egalitarianism and of recognizing human rights as a core element of how decisions can be made. Okay, you have this within different forms, within different subgroups, inside China, inside Taiwan, with Hong Kong, with Northern China versus Southern China, et cetera. So these are, and of course, within Russia. And so one of the classic points is when you have trouble domestically, fight a war. And Putin does that every few months. Okay. All right. Let me just mention briefly that the Lipset reading is just a tiny bit of the work by the leading American political sociologist Seymour Martin Lipset, and it's it's on page 19, and he calls it the creed. What's the American creed, basically? Anybody get these 5 points? Good thing to remember for telling your aunt when you're having dinner at home sometime. How and why are Americans different from if your aunt came from India or from Poland or from somewhere else? What's different and why? I shouldn't say why. Why he doesn't really answer at this point, but he starts to a little bit. What are the 5? Egalitarianism, liberty, individualism, populism, and laissez-faire. These are not uniquely, all of these were invented in Europe and developed in different ways, but they were combined and taken further. And just for example, so Lipset doesn't really talk about the origins in this chapter. Elazar does. Elazar has 50 books on all kinds of these things with lots of subtlety and so forth. But let me just say that his simple answer here to Lipset would be religion and values and politics are mainly carried on people's backs and in their heads. As they move, they take their values with them. So if you live in a so-called Polish neighborhood in Chicago, you can see Polish values at work in ways that you would not in Bronzeville in an African-American neighborhood, and so forth. So, so to apply that to the values of the US, at the time of the revolution in the late 18th century in the US, the people who really supported the King of England and hierarchy moved. Some went back to England, others went to Canada. And so Canada preserved a sense of hierarchy and deference toward the king. And then so Lipset has a whole book, couple of books on Canada, as he was fascinated of initially, why do they have socialism in Western Canada? How can they have this at all? Why don't we have more socialism in the US? And why are unions, these were Lipset's conflictual driver kinds of questions. How was the frontier settled in the US? Cowboys. How was the frontier settled in Canada? The Mounties. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police with their red uniforms would march at the head of groups of hundreds of people who would go to the next town, and they would create a town under the authority of the King of England, directly led by them militarily. All right, so this is one of about, I had a student do a couple of students work on papers. There are about 150 examples, qualitative, quantitative. The Canadians have more life insurance than do Americans, et cetera, et cetera. There are all kinds of things like this that show, even though the two countries are very, very close, if you compare to India or China, whatever, there are big differences like that, which are a product in part of these initial changes. The Canadians are proud of their health insurance. Americans are proud they don't have health insurance for everybody in the nation, et cetera. We have lower taxes, et cetera. Okay. Or it's a highly divisive battle between the Democrats and the Republicans now, both from Bill Clinton through Barack Obama through okay, and then continuing. So the quick summary is these are Protestant moralistic inspired values, which Lipset goes into more detail and measures and talks about, but the sources come in a broader historical context from Elazar's discussion of migration and the ethnicity background. I mean, that's to simplify a bit. I'll just add one more variable, which is the frontier. He has a proposition that as you settle a frontier, especially in the American way, not the Canadian way, that tends to create more egalitarianism because everybody arrives at the same time. They're not more senior, more traditionally established families who own more land or something like that. Everybody arrives together and you all live either, on a say a Kansas area that could grow corn, or in later years, a suburban house outside of New York or Chicago or LA, where you have thousands of houses that look identical. That sense of moving out of a central city or moving from Massachusetts to LA into a suburb where all the houses in Orange County look, I shouldn't say Orange County, there are lots of differences within Orange County. But the houses may just look the same. That the sense of egalitarianism is heightened through migration in ways that these are general patterns which apply globally. So I'm pulling these out from the deep history you get in Elazar more generally. All right, so I'm giving you just a couple of quick points from these three readings. The last one is Engelhardt. I'd say I'll just give you some page numbers. Look at 75, 76 for the core ideas of the reading, summarized in a graph and a table. Page 86 on the religious importance of Americans. Americans are more religious than most other countries of the world, although that pales if you bring in the Middle East, especially these days, and for aspects, India. Page 89, not wanting homosexuals as neighbors, a key post-modern value of social tolerance. Page 93, a key chart on well-being and secular rational authority. And page 102 shows the correlates of the two so-called post-modern dimensions: income, education, less government spending per capita, high life expectancy, number of years, democratic. That is what we're showing you here are statistical analyses of the values that Lipset identified, which go back to Elazar. Engelhardt is measuring these with big surveys around the whole world. So he can tell you, people in Delhi support say this, and then you can compare people in Delhi with people in LA and so forth, or certainly nationally, but sometimes you've got city-specific data in the case of India and China. So you don't need to say there's a qualitative, quantitative difference which makes one of these unique or whatever. Both are combined in our readings in these sections. Okay, I've got several other examples I'm skipping over of scandals and what were scandals in Europe, how did political moralism then redefine them. But these were also the classic doing this about where did American values come from was, of course, Tocqueville. And he was sent here as a French emissary from the royally created French Academy to study where and why they have crime and how jails work in the US. And he started with that, but he expanded it to a book which became Democracy in America, in 2 volumes, and it's still considered one of the, if not the most valuable, single, insightful book about how Americans think and work and act, even though many aspects, as I'm suggesting here, really are really European. But one thing which he points out repeatedly is how these things may vary with a strong state or even a dictator, and how this is globally and gradually undermined by global forces. And what specifically is likely to change is the Northern European Protestant cultural ideals diffuse worldwide because they change when they go to Hong Kong or they go to Argentina. One way to try to bring in, without being country, region period specific, is to talk about three kinds of politics, which are, again, widely used. Clientelism first, class politics second, and the new political culture third, or reform, has many different names. And then the movement from one to the next tends to increase with globalization. Even if you have a peasant background and you're living in a farm which has been in your family for hundreds or even thousands of years, if you're watching social media, as Chinese villagers now do, they're watching social media, which can include things from around the world. And they're doing this more than they're bowling together in their little town square. There's a deep transformation where you've got these conflicting potential culture shocks going on. Okay. Tocqueville's frequent and most simple comparisons in his book in general are between France and the US, but he uses them, especially France, and France is still the best case in Europe, of having a stronger hierarchy and a strong state existing and present, with strong goals to implement. And what are the strong goals? What are the three strongest goals that the state is choosing to implement, and where do they come from? Today and for a couple of centuries. Liberty, equality, and fraternity, where do they come from? 1789, the guillotine, kill off the king, bring in the people. How was this spread across France and then into Germany, into parts of Russia, through the Austro-Hungarian Empire and Italy, down to Egypt? Who did that? Napoleon. So Napoleon was a mini version of Genghis Khan, but unlike Genghis Khan, who really did not have a program like that, Napoleon was Italian. He came from an Italian family. He spoke broken French his entire life. His father was an Italian-born administrator, and so his father took him when Napoleon was teenager to Versailles, so his son would learn the subtleties of French power politics and how to do it. When the king was still king, this was Versailles before the revolution. So Napoleon learned how to do kingly politics, and then the revolution came along, and what did Napoleon do? He changed his politics. He took the three. Oh yeah, no, not the king. Yes, liberty, equality, fraternity, and I'll take that to Germany, and I'll take it to Eastern Europe, and they'll love me for it. And they did. Hegel, Beethoven dedicated books and statements about the emperor. One of Beethoven's symphonies was called The Emperor, etc. So that the idea of destroying anti-Semitism, breaking down the feudal hierarchies in Germany and parts of Eastern Europe, this was seen as the revolution is coming to us, and we didn't have to guillotine anybody. Napoleon did the hard, those revolutionaries did the hard work, and Napoleon is bringing to his okay. And he didn't kill people the way Genghis Khan did. Genghis Khan, that's the important point. Genghis Khan didn't kill it always. He killed maybe people in one big city, the capital city. It's pretty big, important, but he didn't kill everybody, and especially in Russia. So Napoleon was embraced in many ways at the beginning. Then as Napoleon got tougher and more hierarchical, then you had people turning against him, not only within France or within Germany, but of course, the English. And so the English mobilized with some others, with some Italians and etc. And Napoleon was defeated. But throughout the 19th century, the institution, if we look at some specific mechanisms of how do these things get implemented, the thing which Tocqueville focused on most visibly, which Americans and especially Putnam now talk about was what? Civic groups, especially churches. Americans are the most religious people in the world. Until recently, the university educated people are not going to church, but until very recently, churches are really critical. And there were lots of them. There wasn't one Roman Catholic Church and one Vatican. We have 100 versions of Protestantism, which are surveyed and measured in every county in the United States by the American Association of, the National Association of Churches of Christ, which also includes Muslims and Jews and Hindus and others. So these multiple affiliations and their diversity simultaneous with being next door to each other permitted and enhanced tolerance in ways that did not exist in France. And when you had the French and the German and the Italian and the Spanish colonies in the 19th century, if someone wanted to start a new church in Ghana, in South Africa, in somewhere else, in maybe, I won't go into Latin America, well, largely so, certainly at the beginning in Latin America, what happened to them? They were killed, basically. The Genghis Khan solution, anybody who doesn't follow our religion. By contrast, the English colonies, we've got a couple of faces here who are Indian in background. In the English colonies, the English said, the English colonial administrators said, we will permit you nonconformists, that is Calvinists. The English called them nonconformists. It means nonconforming to the Church of England. And they were Baptists. They were Presbyterians. They would go to Africa and translate the Bible into Swahili. They would go to India and they would help build churches. So even though not many Hindus became Christians, unlike the situation in many parts of Africa, the ideals of egalitarianism were spread. And similarly in Africa, this is how people learn to read and write, by reading the Bible, and to try to learn about the Bible from a Calvinist egalitarian perspective. Christianity is a culture of slaves, as it arose that way in Rome, with the beginnings of the Vatican and eventually the decline of the Roman Empire. Okay, if that's the simple point, the second critical point to take away from Tocqueville is that he distinguished individualism from the French version of individualism, which would be more labeled by English-speaking persons as egoism, just grabbing things that you want. If you go to a line in London and wait for a bus or a taxi, people automatically and without being ordered form a line. They stand behind each other. You wait for a taxi in Paris and everybody tries to grab the door at the same time. People don't form a line at a bus to get into it. So in that sense, there's in its manifestation like this, there's a sense more generally of the commonwealth, the common good, the public interest. These conceptions which you have mixed together with or without these different themes vary in how central they are in different subcultures, or as we call them, scenes. And these scenes dimensions transform the bigger meaning, the more abstract idea of egalitarianism or individualism or transgression or whatever. And Tocqueville wrote about these often in detail to show how and why. And he was amazed to see the degree to which people who were building a fence together, they hated each other. One was a farmer and the other had animals. They didn't want the animals eating the farmer's food. So they said, okay, well, let's build a fence together. They would collaborate and they would tell people about it. And they might have 3 people who would show you how to build fences, how to chop down the trees, what kind of axe you needed, what kind of saw, and how that would work. And Tocqueville, in describing things like this in Western Massachusetts, was saying, we don't do this in France. If we get one thing that we like, we don't tell anybody. We don't share it with anybody else. But again, these things are not unique to France and the US. Ruth Benedict, who wrote about in the most brilliant book about Japanese culture and society, which the Japanese themselves for decades and decades would teach to the high school kids of Japan, read about who you are, the way Americans read about Tocqueville and found out who we are. It took a foreigner, Ruth Benedict, an anthropologist from Columbia in New York. And she talks about, for instance, at every traditional wedding, the mayor would come and the mayor would write down how many gifts were given by which family to the wedding couple. Was this just for fun? No. The wedding couple and his family felt the duty, the to return in an appropriate form a bottle of wine or a box of rice. And the strongest, just one other example, and if the brother or sister did not properly meet their family obligations to this other family, the siblings should take them over in the next generation, either that or the next generation. So the sense of family and obligation is a clientelist way, it's a clientelist set of rules of the game for how culture defines morality, is right or wrong. Morality, maybe I shouldn't use that word. So rules of the game is a better term, which has a specific, that is, sociologists distinguish norms and values. The norms are rules of the game, like don't cross against a red light. So let me give you one example from France that I participated in. I was doing a book with Vincent Hoffman Martineau, who was then a young professor in Bordeaux, I think more recently, it used to be more like 6 hours by train, one way. If he wanted it, we were writing a book together called The New Political Culture. If he wanted to make one new table for the book, he had to get on a train, go to Paris, and find the one man in Paris who had control of the SPSS program. Nobody else could use SPSS unless they came to him and made a personal visit, personal, not, after masks, whatever. Think of teaching online, none of that, personal. And he'd done so, and so he could use SPSS under the tutelage of this one man. And then he'd make the table and he'd go back to Bordeaux and he'd write it up and he'd send me something and we'd continue. So I said, Vincent, this is crazy. We're now, and then so I said one day, hey, SPSS is now available on a PC. You can put this little program it becomes what's now called an app. Okay. And so Vincent said, wow, that would be a revolution. So I took SPSS down to Bordeaux when I was there, teaching at the Sorbonne, and I said, I'm busy at meetings, but could I install it on Saturday on a PC here? So Vincent said, oh, no. The Institute is, again, the state, the bureaucratic rules, the Institute is closed on the weekend. So they got the communist head guard to agree that I could come there for 2 hours only on Saturday afternoon and install the program. And he was then accompanied by the Secretary General of the whole Institute, hundreds of people, but behind the guard was the Communist Party. And so the union, I'm contrasting this now visibly with the taxi driver in Tokyo, who has a sense of the public good, maybe something different. And I'm showing you one of the sources of the lack of illustration of the Commonwealth in the union defined activities of the Secretary General, who then said, I want to have this because I teach a course. He came from what's the biggest industry in Bordeaux? Wine. He came from the Wine Association, And he taught a course on drinking and tasting different French wines, knowing about the French literature, and then he wanted to add in SPSS. So this is the story of how I added SPSS to French general culture. Okay. SPSS was invented by a political science colleague here, invented with a couple of collaborators called Norman Nye at the USC. Okay, so I helped them install it, and the Secretary General was delighted to have it available. And then you know, a couple of months later, I talked to Vincent. I said, "Are you using it more generally at Sciences Po, at the School of Political Science?" So, well, my institute director said, "No, you can't share it with anybody else. It's only for our little institute within the whole school." So the sense of turf, and how big is the sense of turf? What is Commonwealth and what is not? There's a French tradition which is not uniquely French, for sure. Some people have said that the Russians learned about capitalism from Marx, and therefore you have a gangsterized version of dominating, at least in the first years after the Berlin Wall went down. The point is, the analytical point I'm making is that these are variables. They combine egalitarianism, individualism, trust, and how big is the geographic unit that Adam Smith kept stressed so much? How big is the extent of the market? If your turf is your institute or you only, or that Italian guy who wouldn't burn his candle to the god, that Italian guy also doesn't trust his wife, and his wife doesn't trust her husband, according to the Banfield's own family that he lived there for a year, and his own wife, who was from the town. Okay, so I'm pushing onward to Putnam. Putnam's big contrast, of course, is northern versus southern Italy. And I gave you a quick version of the egalitarianism came with trade, with discovering the ancient texts from the ancient Greeks and ancient Jews, and reading and thinking about these within Florence and Venice. And then these were so visible and successful that it really created, to simplify, the Renaissance. And the Renaissance, in a sense, is saying that it's a rebirth of Europe, because Europe had the so-called, I mean, they define themselves dark ages, from the decline of the Italians, especially from the decline of the Roman Empire to the Renaissance. And so the Renaissance, led by painters, by Leonardo da Vinci and so forth, bringing science and knowledge and the arts together, and bringing with it a sense of a new sense of how to be creative with this, and not simply administer in bureaucratic manner the Roman Catholic Church. Why were there regional differences? Okay, the Italians and their historians have documented this. They've documented the differences for generations, but Putnam found two Italian collaborators, and with him, they went out and tried to document the degree of egalitarianism and the degree of trust and the degree of clientelism within these different regions of Italy. Okay, now many people say clientelism is so subtle that you can't study it except with intense field work. And that's what I mean. I've done that myself in Chicago, and Chicago's politics, in this sense, as illustrated by the classic daily examples, are the opposite of New England. And so most Americans read Tocqueville, and it works in Palo Alto, it works in an affluent suburbs of Boston, and it's pretty much in Cambridge, let's say around Harvard, maybe not so much MIT, but downtown Boston, no. Downtown Boston is Irish politics since about 1900. Or you have reform counters, but even today, these live on, and these live on in different neighborhoods and different legacies, with different aldermen in the city of Chicago, most visibly, because we have big aldermanic, the aldermen are big actors in small geographies, and we have 50 of them to try to reflect the distinctive cultural traits of these immigrant regions fitting Elazar's migration: Polish, Italian, German, African-American, Mexican, Mexicans from one region, Mexicans from another region who have their connections to their villages still very strong. These are critical for understanding Chicago politics today. So why was Southern Italy so different? Who has a quick answer or two? Anybody want to throw out a pro or a con on why the differences? If you've done some reading or not, or read other things like it. Who was the southern version of Genghis Khan for Italy? Southern Italian version of Genghis Khan. The Normans, the same Normans who invaded England, the Normans at the end of these so-called Dark Ages were very smart at building sort of big canoes, I mean, small baby boats. And they'd paddle up the rivers into France, into Italy, and they'd steal the gold and the jewels out of the churches, and they'd take it back to Denmark and Sweden and Norway. What's now those countries. When they got to Italy, or then they settled a part of France that was sort of nice next to England. They settled a couple of towns in England, and they settled the region of France today called Normandy. And in 1066 was this famous Norman invasion, and the Norman, there was a division like Russia under the Tsar. Before there was a Tsar, the English leadership was divided, and they knew about this. The Normans did, so they invaded, and they became, and so we had a new leadership, and so the leadership culture became Norman. Norman Saxon. The Saxons were German, basically a German tribe. So these multiple subgroups within England divided the cultural leadership, even spoke different languages at the beginning, in ways that helped made England a mini version of an immigrant society with more tolerance of subgroups than you had, say, in a France or Italy. All right, but so the Normans then, as I'm mentioning, conquered England. Did they conquer all of Italy? No, just the south. So from Naples into the south, Sardinia and the like, this was Norman conquest. And they ruled like, I shouldn't say like, they ruled with a heavy bureaucratic hand. And that continues in some ways to present. And so the biggest divisions were, and then because they ruled with a hand, people who wanted more treatment, more responsive to them, their friends, their families, their neighbors, who did they go to for help? The mafia. So the mafia developed as a major center of power as an alternative to the bureaucracy. And so just as in Russia, you had the mafia as a transition from the communist tough domination of the past to this kind of messy, quasi-Hobbesian society that we're seeing bits of in Chicago right now. Okay. All right. Some of this, I'm skipping over what you can read in the syllabus. We have a lot of propositions there about hierarchy, anti-hierarchy parties, equality. The simple point is that if you have a lot of hierarchy, you then tend to develop egalitarianism as a strong counter. And the most visible dramatic case is the French Revolution, that you had the king of France, Versailles, and all of Europe came to Versailles, including Napoleon. Napoleon then took the revolution's three key words around the world, again showing equality. That is the individualism combined with this, but equality was the biggest counter. In similar manner, when you had, say, and skipping forward, for instance, the Hong Kong protests, just to take one of the more recent and controversial, The Hong Kong protests, and this is often true in, I think the same thing was true in Belarus. When you had protests, they tended to be very narrow and specific at the beginning. As they built up more momentum and more challenging, they began to spread in the issues which they confronted, and they pretty soon became against the hierarchy, against the leadership, against the man. And so in that way, that is, people don't generally have a whole program that, we want more rights for the workers in a cafeteria or something like that. But if you can treat it as, we have racial oppression, or we don't have a recognition that the family or women are not being treated equally, then you can try to create women or Blacks as a broader label for, that is, egalitarianism is too broad, that's everybody. So if you can deal with a smaller subgroup, but not so small as to say only the cafeteria workers at the USC are being mistreated. And so you have these intermediary groups. So the simple proposition which we have is elaborated in a book called The New Political Culture, which is hierarchy tends to generate anti-hierarchy. But corollary, as hierarchy goes down after the revolution in Paris, or after the Berlin Wall went down in Western Europe with the Cold War, you develop more differentiated special interest groups or social groups or civic groups. And so Tocqueville saw these earliest because there was no king inside America. Unlike Canada, Canada had the king still. The US did not. The US did not have peasants. They still talked about peasants in the 19th century in much of the world. So the sense, or in the caste system in India, doesn't need much comment. That is, the broader sense of egalitarianism earlier on led to these churches and all kinds of little things like abolition of slavery and abolition of liquor were the two biggest 19th century issues that he documented. And they were led, as I mentioned, by women, even though women didn't have a national vote. Women can be political activists with or without a vote in a national election. National election is not the only way that you can have lots of democratic activities, or let's say all kinds of activities. So I'm beginning to generalize just a little bit here and say that as an extra reading, which you can glance at, but the bottom line says Olson's book on collective action. He asked the question, why did the Japanese and the Germans develop economically so fast after World War II? That is, not only did the Koreans and Chinese, but within Europe, the Germans at least shared with the French strong communist egalitarian unions in the 1930s. The French and the English, I'll just add by comparison, the French and the English stultified economically in the 40s, 50s, 60s. The Germans and the Japanese took off. They built the economic miracle. How and why? And Olson's answer is challenging Tocqueville and Putnam in a sense was the old civic groups, including the trade unions, were so allied with the Japanese emperor and so allied with Hitler that they lost total legitimacy. And instead there was a sort of political vacuum. And so strong management, strong government actions was not weakened by the unions and others who would try to reinforce regulations which would protect or help workers have more autonomy. Okay, so it's an interesting, it's got some truth, some validity in some contexts. It's wrong in perhaps some others. But an analogous later version is the new political culture of people like, that is the NPC we documented first with, it began locally with Peter Flaherty, we documented as mayor of Pittsburgh. And it then it became visible nationally, not just when we wrote the book, but years later with Bill Clinton and Tony Blair, made this kind of egalitarian traditional, not traditional left, but a more populist egalitarianism using the media. And they said, we want to join social liberalism. We want to give equal rights to women, equal rights to children, equal rights to everybody. No racism, etc. No anti-Semitism, etc., etc. At the same time, they said, we're going to continue Margaret Thatcher's budget. We're not going to increase taxes. That was the big difference with the traditional left. So it's a combination of fiscal caution with social liberalism. How can you do that? And the New York Times and others within the two parties would say you can't. You've either got a Republican or be a traditional Republican or a traditional Democrat. But then we went to surveys and found, if you look at surveys in Japan and Western Europe and the US, the majority of citizens they don't want racism, they don't want sexism. They support most of this egalitarianism, but they also say, lower taxes, please. So how can you combine lower taxes with feminism? It was something like 54% of white American women voted for Trump. You didn't hear that in the Clinton campaign. So people can be issue specific in their politics in ways that make the traditional rules from the past fall apart. Okay, so that I'm just leading, one point I'm making here is that the populist leader, or the leader who can act and succeed in a populist way with certain populist policies, can have huge impact, but often fights the unions and the bureaucrats to come to office. More generally, centralization, actually, I'll stop here. Stop here for discussion. You've been very thoughtfully quiet. Let me listen and try to talk with Q&A for a bit. Take an example that anything that you thought about or think about that I said that seems controversial or doesn't work in your hometown, and let's talk about it, of why either it fits or it doesn't, or probably the context can help clarify where and why. That is, I'm not saying, I'm implicitly saying the world is multi-causal. But the more we get away from one strong top leader and then one group of people at the bottom, and as we get to more activation of more civic groups, it gets more and more multi-causal and complicated, and we need more concepts beyond the left, beyond the right, beyond capitalism and so forth, to understand the specifics of global local politics. But it's not all the same everywhere. We're bringing in these regional differences in like northern France and northern and southern Italy, northern and southern France as well. Not as strong, but still there. All right. So comments or questions? We got.
Aaron, you can you can unmute yourself and add.
Yeah. Aaron, you want to go ahead?
Yeah, Professor, I actually had a question about the lip-set reading really quick,
Sure.
if that's okay.
Absolutely.
I just kind of want to start out. It was a pretty interesting read, but I just had a question about that American creed that he described in 5 terms: the liberty, egalitarianism, individualism, populism, and laissez-faire. I was just kind of wondering, and I'm assuming he kind of explains it a little more throughout the book, of course, but is he saying that those ideas kind of work in concert together, or that there are different parts in American history where one kind of takes precedence over another, or they work in tangent at different times, or because I guess actually just really briefly, part of the thesis I'm writing is about actually like the interplay of like individualism and populism in the United States. So I was just kind of wondering, does he mean that there is like a weird paradoxical notion of building a collectivity out of individuals? Or does he mean it in another way, I guess?
I mean, all of the above is correct. That is, he uses them in this book, in this chapter, to make it sound as if they're one set of values, and he calls the American Creed. But in his earlier books, when he that is, he was a Trotskyite himself in the 1930s. He saw the world in political and politics as conflict, conflict, conflict. And he then at the end of his life moved toward more seeing the broader cultural assumptions which undergird the conflicts. And so he did chapters and books, as did, I mean, another guy working on related issues was Aaron Gildovsky. Both of them wrote histories of America. Gildovsky went all the way from the ancient Greeks to the present. Lipset has a couple of books on different American presidents, showing as you go from the one, say, today, Democratic and Republican, and I mean, pretty visibly from Trump to Biden, they react against each other and very explicitly saying, you know, we're going to abolish every one of those things which the last president did. And they visibly are doing this, you know, on the media to consciously say, I'm against those values. So yes, for sure, they can be in deep conflict. Good question. And yes, he then has two chapters where he says, are these shared? And so he says there are two groups within American society who do not share in these because they feel very much excluded and have historically. And they are the Jews and the Japanese. So he goes back to the history of the Jews and the history and within Japan to show where and why the Japanese are different and where and why within the US, the World War II camps which you know locked up the Japanese immigrants in the West. It was not everywhere, but it was in California and the like. But within the US, I'll just point out, because I didn't know this until a couple of years ago, in places like in the east of the Mississippi, none of the Japanese were taken aside, you know, put into concentration camps almost. And so this is still a hot issue among Japanese Americans today. So the broader point is, yes, the values are distinct, but how distinctive and how much they are politicized into open conflict or even forceful, you know, locking up people or calling this a crime, and how strong a crime varies by context. And that's the foundation of all the stuff we'll talk about on Wednesday about scenes. But either if you want to elaborate on that, Aaron, or anybody else on a similar theme, please do. I mean, another way of just one more sentence, and then we'll go to Shiblaxmi. But that Elazar himself went all around to every county in the U.S. and he made little maps showing how the three political cultures that he talked about, New England, Middle Atlantic, and the South, how strong each of them were within each of the counties in the U.S. And we've then used those data for interesting analyses, and hundreds of years later, they still hold more strongly than income inequality or overall income or education or many other standard variables. Okay, Shiblaxmi, Ray? Go ahead. Yeah, okay, turning on your speaker.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, that's fine.
So when you suggested that egalitarianism develops in response to when there are strong hierarchies, and then eventually as the hierarchies go down, you have these sort of differentiated civic groups that cater to different interests. I mean, in contemporary times, would you suggest that there are these sort of waves when there is sort of an egalitarian wave in response to a hierarchy? Because in my experience, if there has been egalitarian response to a hierarchy that exists. It has been the hierarchies kind of reproduce themselves within these new egalitarian cultures that do emerge. So, I mean, is the suggestion that there will be a new culture that is completely egalitarian and then the hierarchy will reinvent itself? Or is it that hierarchies will not, they will sort of counter those hierarchies? Because I don't think that works in all contexts.
Yeah, no, excellent question. Two ways of answering. First, there's always a contextual historical background for, you know, one neighborhood in Mumbai or one neighborhood in Chicago, which will shift the degree to which hierarchy may still be more legitimate and more followed by new, potentially challenging organizations. So that's the general point. But second, more specifically, in the section on new social movements, we'll look at the book called The Third Sector. And one key point there is that that after, say, roughly the year 2000, we began to see globally in Europe and the US more of these protest groups that would not, that is initially, where did the new social movements come from? The term came from the 70s. And after the 1968 revolutions, student revolutions in Paris, Colombia, New York, et cetera, in Italy, they've been studied in great detail by the Italians. Within Italy, for example, the political parties were so strong, they would give money to social movements to pretend that they were independent, and they would work on the environment, or they'd work on women's issues. And but they were really staffed by, or staffed is too strong. They were assisted by the office of the mayor and her political party in places like Florence, where this was studied in detail. So that's a strong form of support for your point that the hierarchy can persist, even if officially it is seen as improper and it's sort of hidden. And so, or if you look at even, say, the American Sierra Club, they have membership dues. You pay your money annually, you get a card, you can be an officer, you can be a board member, you can be a voting member or a non-voting member if you pay your dues or not. Okay, these are structures which continue a sense, a little bit of hierarchy. Reacting against these, like the Calvinists reacted against the Lutherans, are what we've called, and we need a better term, but at this point I've been using the new social movements. Two news. Okay, the second new means they have no officers, they have no membership, they have no board, they have probably no budget, and it's whoever shows up is a member. And they do things like march in parades. They may build puppets together to march in the parade, but who's gonna put on the puppet uniform, and who's gonna sew the uniform, who's gonna wear it, who will sing, or who will be joining with it, is all spontaneous and moment. I won't say there's no coordination, but the visible examples, the most visible examples of these globally were after the Occupy Wall Street movement. The Occupy Wall Street movement first occupied Wall Street, but it then spread to hundreds of other cities around the world, and it was not led by anybody. It wasn't, there were unions, there were left political parties, there were feminists, there were gays, there were Blacks, there were students, there were non-students. But the point is, no one of these, and I had lots of students who work with me, and when they came to Chicago, and Chicago was particularly, because it was the anniversary of the 1968 movement. I guess I can't remember the year, but it was 20-30 years after that. And I went around on my bike, I talked to people, et cetera, for several days, because it was very big stuff. There were massive numbers of National Guards, policemen from Chicago, state policemen, all kinds of troops. They lined the streets of Michigan Avenue, Cermak Avenue, et cetera, et cetera. and the USC students, as they then wrote up maybe a dozen or so papers of this, from each did different kinds of field work with different groups. The main reaction of the USC students was, This is no movement. There's no intellectual core. There's no program. There's nothing, you know, and the movement that the USC students wanted to be feminist or Black Power or Democrats or something. And they wanted to have a coherent intellectual program. And they said, as I saw and I took photos, lots of people are just taking pictures of each other. They're having fun. They're wearing great outfits. And one time there was a woman one woman who started to say, "Oh, you policemen." And as soon as she started to shout, someone tapped her on the arm and said, "No, no protest." There was self-control to be civil, not to challenge all those policemen, and not to have a program. That's a new social, nobody knows what their organizations were. That's messy, very individualistic. I won't say totally, for sure, it's not atomistic, but it's hard to capture with the old, and it's the, so yes, but so what you said continues in Italy with my example there near Florence, and it continues globally with these new kinds of Occupy movements in especially the last 20 years. We are at the end of the hour. We will continue with office hours for anyone who wants to stay on for a bit more. And thank you for your participation. Yeah, we'll continue next time with the next readings on the list for this section are the Tocqueville book and the Scenescapes book. So read what you can of those. We'll discuss them and related issues.